In this chapter, we'll talk some about animal reproduction and development, but most of what we're going to do over the next two videos is to talk about the human reproductive system. So animals can reproduce asexually or sexually. Asexual reproduction does not require a partner and produces either identical or nearly identical offspring. And a good example of this is bacteria producing by binary fission, and this produces clones of the parent cell. So if you look at the diagram to the right, you'll see that the parent cell contains one chromosome, and the DNA is going to replicate and attach to the cell membrane. Once this happens, you get membrane growth between the two different attachment points, and this moves the DNA molecules apart as the new cell wall material gets deposited. And your result of binary fission is going to be two daughter cells, each of which is identical to the original one. In sexual reproduction, you have both parents contributing genes to the offspring, and the offspring are then genetically unique. So even though sexual reproduction expends a lot of energy both finding and courting mates, the variation among the offspring is really a good adaptation for changing environments. So environments are not going to stay the same from century to century, maybe not even from year to year or from decade to decade. And so if the environment changes, whether it's the weather changing or maybe new predators coming in or a new disease coming in, any sort of variation among the offspring is going to help maintain a population of that species. And so this means that the genes of organisms that use sexual reproduction are more likely to be passed on. So the gonads of sexually reproducing individuals, these produce haploid gametes by meiosis. So males produce sperm, and this is shown in the below image, and females produce eggs. Now, you may not realize this, but this doesn't just happen in animals. This also happens in fungi, and it also happens in plants. And so all of this pollen that has been dropping on your car is actually a stage of the life cycle of a plant called a gametophyte. And that gametophyte actually pretty much is the pollen grain, which contains a couple of sperm cell nuclei in it. Now, gametes will unite at fertilization, and these will form a diploid zygote. So among sexually reproducing species, fertilization can either be internal or external. And you see in the top picture here that the male sea urchin there is just releasing sperm into the water. So if the sperm cells that are there, if they unite with an egg cell that's released from a female, then you've got external fertilization. So basically, the sea urchin, the males sort of just dump their sperm into the water, and the females sort of just dump their eggs into the water. And what they're kind of hoping will happen, not that sea urchins hope for anything, but you get the meaning. The goal here is for the sperm that have been released to fertilize eggs that have been released. Now, internal fertilization occurs when the gametes unite inside the body of one of the parents, and this is usually the female. I can't think of an instance where it doesn't happen inside the female, as in these birds. That is when fertilization occurs. Now, once fertilization has occurred, there are a few male species that will host the developing embryo. And so the female hosts the fertilization, but the male, so to speak, kind of gets pregnant. So basically the female will transfer a fertilized egg to the male, and he'll have a pouch or something that he'll raise it in. Seahorses do this. So the zygote is going to begin to divide very soon after fertilization is complete. And part of the process of cell division or development is something that's called differentiation, where cells acquire specialized functions. And so as these cells begin to differ from one another, different genes will determine the overall shape and structure of the animal's body, and this process is called pattern formation. So you can see here that there are different stages in which you've got cell division, 1 to 2 to 4 cells, and so forth, until you start to see an embryo sort of take shape way over on the right. Now, development can be what's called direct or indirect. An animal that undergoes indirect development has an immature stage that looks very different from the adult. So caterpillar to a butterfly is a great example. Tadpole to a frog would be another great example. So these would be examples of indirect development. With direct development, you have an immature stage that looks maybe not exactly like a small adult, but mostly like a small adult. So turtles are shown here as an example, lizards, dogs, cats, us. I know that babies to us may not look a tremendous amount like adults, but babies look a whole lot more like adults than caterpillars do butterflies. So we are definitely an organism that undergoes direct development. So now we're going to talk about the human reproductive system for the rest of these two videos. So this is the human male reproductive system. The paired testes are the male gonads, and these will produce sex hormones and sperm cells. And so what we're going to do with this is we're going to take a look at the process of sperm formation and take a look at its pathway on the way out of the male body. So within each testis, you've got tubules called seminiferous tubules, and sperm production actually occurs in the walls of these tubules. And it's so there's the seminiferous tubule, and the second diagram is a cross section through the seminiferous tubule. And a type of cell called Sertoli cells will surround and support and nourish developing sperm. So they really are support cells for developing sperm. Interstitial cells, which you see highlighted here, fill the spaces between tubules, and these are mainly responsible for secreting testosterone, male sex hormones. Diploid germ cells called spermatogonia, what these are going to do is they're going to divide by mitosis into primary spermatocytes. And so at this point, you've got two cells. The primary spermatocyte is going to be genetically identical to the spermatogonium. Now, each primary spermatocyte divides by meiosis, and meiosis is actually what yields two secondary spermatocytes. So now, after this first round of meiosis, you're going to have two secondary spermatocytes that are actually genetically different from the primary spermatocyte. And the other thing is, they're only going to contain half the number of chromosomes. The next thing that happens is that the secondary spermatocytes undergo meiosis too, and it yields 4 spermatids. And about 74 days after the original division, you'll have mature sperm cells getting released into the lumen, or the opening, of the seminiferous tubule. So this diagram is kind of summarizes sperm development. So you have a germ cell giving rise to another germ cell by mitosis. Then this gives rise to 2 primary spermatocytes. This gives rise to 2 secondary spermatocytes, which gives rise to 4 spermatids. And then you have a further process of development and maturation that leads to mature sperm cells. So each mature sperm cell has got a haploid nucleus, meaning that it's only got 1 copy of each chromosome. As adult humans, we've all got 2 copies of each chromosome, but a sperm cell only has 1 copy of each chromosome. So when it combines with a haploid egg, then you form an embryo that is back to diploid. So not only does it have the haploid nucleus, it also has a long flagellum or tail, mitochondria which help power it, and an acrosome that helps it penetrate the egg cell, and we'll get into how it does this in just a few minutes. So now we're going to talk about where sperm are stored and the route that sperm take out of the body, and what else is actually added to semen along the way in the human male reproductive system. So first of all, mature sperm are stored in the epididymis, which you see outlined in green here. Now sperm will travel from the epididymis into the vas deferens, and this is a duct or tube that passes above the urinary bladder and attaches with what's called an ejaculatory duct. Now, close to the end of this vas deferens, you have a seminal vesicle, which you see highlighted in green, and this actually secretes most of the fluid that goes into semen. From the seminal vesicle, the sperm and the products of the seminal vesicle travel to the urethra. The prostate gland surrounds part of the urethra, and it's highlighted there, and this secretes an alkaline fluid that will actually activate sperm to help them swim. This is the bulbourethral gland, and they secrete an alkaline mucus that helps do two things. First of all, it will help prepare the urethra for sperm. Now, in men, the urethra carries both semen and urine. Sometimes the urine can be acidic, and that could damage the sperm on the way out, which is not something that you want to have happening. And so the bulbourethral glands will secrete an alkaline mucus that will help neutralize any acidity in the urethra, and it will also help neutralize the acidity of the female vagina. So here you see all of these products coming together. Now, sperm will travel through the urethra, and during ejaculation, the penis will discharge semen from the body through the urethra. So hormones actually influence male reproductive function. You may hear a lot about hormones and female reproduction, but there are hormones which influence male reproductive function, and this is the way that things go. So if you look up at the top where the hypothalamus is, the hypothalamus secretes GnRH. This is gonadotropin releasing hormone, and what that hormone does is to instruct the anterior pituitary to secrete two hormones called FSH and LH, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Now, these two hormones will cause different things to happen in the testes. So FSH generally calls for more sperm production, and LH is actually more for producing higher levels of testosterone. So FSH in males will stimulate sperm production more so than testosterone production, and LH will stimulate testosterone production more so than sperm production. The human female reproductive system includes two ovaries, which you see outlined in the square box up and to the right. So you see the label that's pointing to the ovary, and each one of these ovaries is surrounded by finger-like extensions, which you can see in light pink, of one uterine tube. And so the uterine tubes are also known as fallopian tubes. So the eggs get produced in the ovaries, and they get collected then by the uterine tubes. One of the kind of unusual things about this is that the uterine tubes don't attach directly to the ovary. They have an indirect connection, and the way that eggs get produced or ovulated from the ovaries is that they actually kind of burst through the walls of the ovary, and then those finger-like extensions on the end of the uterine tubes sort of wave and create a current that sucks the egg up into the uterine tube. Egg production begins very early in life. So there are germ cells called oogonia, which you had spermatogonia in males, you have oogonia in females. So these divide by mitosis into primary oocytes before the female is even born. So the ovaries contain over 1 million primary oocytes. Each one of them have sort of stopped in prophase 1 of meiosis. And so you may have heard the statement that women are born with all of the eggs that they are ever going to have. And this is true. They're born with way more than they will ever use. Each month after puberty begins, you have one primary oocyte completing meiosis 1. And so each of these oocytes is within a follicle, and you'll see arrows at the bottom pointing to different follicles. Now, these are mature follicles. There is a development process that leads to this maturation. So meiosis 1 is going to give you a secondary oocyte, and it gets released from the ovary. And again, this is called ovulation. At the same time, meiosis 1 also produces a polar body, and this is a haploid cell that doesn't contain much cytoplasm at all, and it's actually not a gamete. It's not something that can be fertilized. So this is where female reproduction really differs from male reproduction in terms of the gametes. So for a male, meiosis 1 will produce 2 viable cells. For females, meiosis 1 produces 1 viable cell and 1 non-viable cell. So after the uterine tubes collect the oocyte, the follicle that the oocyte came out of becomes what's called the corpus luteum. And so the corpus luteum is actually located right here. So you can see the green O's that are pointing to it. And it's also located, let me see if I can use some green here. It's also located right here. That's not a very bright green color. I wish I had more options. Okay, so the secondary oocyte is sort of freezes in meiosis 2. And as it does this, as it's frozen, it will travel along the uterine tube. Now, what happens to the oocyte depends on whether fertilization happens or not. So if fertilization doesn't happen, the oocyte never completes that meiosis 2. If fertilization happens, then meiosis 2 actually completes after the sperm nucleus has entered the egg cell. And so for just a very small amount of time, you're going to have what's called a pronucleus, a male pronucleus and a female pronucleus, and those will exist at the same time in the fertilized egg for a very short time until the female nucleus completes its meiosis 2, and then the two will combine and you have a fertilized egg. So here are the events of egg development. So you'll have a germ cell that produces primary oocytes. Now, the egg cell is in the middle and you've got the cells that surround it, and you may notice there's not a lot of fluid in the follicles yet. This is normal. In meiosis 2, you have sort of cell division of the cells that surround the oocyte. Again, the oocyte is the large cell with the purple nucleus, and the other cells that surround it are very small ones, sort of in that brick color. Then it will become a secondary oocyte after it completes meiosis 1. Now at this point, a polar body is produced and extruded from the cell, and the secondary oocyte will stop in metaphase 2. So at this point, ovulation occurs, and the secondary oocyte gets ovulated. Now, if fertilization occurs, then you end up with a zygote and 3 polar bodies. If the egg cell isn't fertilized, then you end up with a secondary oocyte that's arrested in metaphase 2 and 2 polar bodies. So what will happen to the egg if it's not fertilized? It's washed out with the uterine lining during menstruation. So whether or not an egg cell gets fertilized, it travels from the uterine tube into the uterus. If it's fertilized, it'll implant, and if it's not fertilized, it won't. So you see the direction of the beige arrows showing you the direction of the egg cell coming from the uterine tube down to the uterus. So the unfertilized egg can either be reabsorbed into the body, or I think what's more common is that it gets discharged during menstruation. And so the menstrual flow will exit the body through the cervix, which is the opening between, or the area between the uterus and the vagina, and then on through the vagina. So you can see, again, the beige arrow showing you the direction of menstrual flow. Now, a fertilized egg has something completely different happening to it, at least you're hoping it does. So it will begin cell division before it even reaches the uterus. So in day 2, you'll see 2 cells. By day 3, you'll see multiple cells in a stage called a morula. So the uterus will implant in the uterine lining. And what happens at this point is that the corpus luteum, remember that ruptured follicle structure, the corpus luteum will actually produce progesterone and estrogen, and these will prevent menstruation. And what this does is this allows the embryo to be retained and to implant in the uterus. So the female reproductive cycle also is influenced by hormones. So the hypothalamus will produce GnRH, again that's gonadotropin releasing hormone. This stimulates the anterior pituitary to release FSH and LH. And FSH, in this case, follicle stimulating hormone, this will stimulate the development of one oocyte within a follicle and its ovulation. What LH will do is to encourage the secretion of progesterone and estrogen. Now, this slide says many hormones that influence male reproductive function also occur in females. That's some wording that I don't really like, because the default for human development is female. So you actually have to introduce a chemical signal to an embryo for it to become male. And so the default for human development is female. So basically all males are altered females. And so I would probably say in that paragraph that many hormones that influence female reproductive function also occur in males. So you may have noticed that you've got FSH and LH in both of them, and FSH is involved with cell production in both males and females, and LH is involved in hormone production in both males and females. And so the reason why you see the same hormones is because basically, as I said, a male is an altered female. So FSH and LH will stimulate the ovaries to secrete progesterone and estrogen, and these will target the uterine lining. And so how do they influence ovulation and menstruation? Well, it turns out that the ovarian cycle controls oocyte maturation in the ovaries. And it's actually LH and FSH which primarily regulate the ovarian cycle. So if you take a look at this, you see LH and FSH at relatively low levels until you reach a certain point of development with a follicle. So at this point, you'll have an LH surge. And so if you look at the bottom diagram where it shows estrogen and progesterone, you'll see increasing amounts of estrogen all the way through the cycle. Most of the time, estrogen will depress LH and FH production. But at a certain estrogen level, it'll reverse its action. And instead of suppressing LH function, it'll actually radically increase LH production. And it's this increase in LH production which causes ovulation. Now, so that is what's called the ovarian cycle. So the menstrual cycle is what helps prepare the uterus for pregnancy. And it's estrogen and progesterone which primarily regulate this menstrual cycle. Now, again, they do also regulate ovulation, as I just told you before. So if you'll take a look at this, at low levels of estrogen and progesterone, just following menstruation, you'll see that the lining of the endometrium, the innermost layer of the uterus in which an embryo implants, you'll see that it's getting thicker over the coming days. And so basically that is preparation for the uterus to be potentially implanted by an embryo. So estrogen and progesterone help regulate the thickness of the endometrium. Now at the end of the cycle, if you haven't had fertilization and implantation, that uterine lining is going to break down and it's going to be sloughed out of the body. And that's what menstruation is. So the concentration of these four hormones fluctuate on about a 28-day cycle. And so generally the first portion before ovulation, that's fairly constant for most women. That's 14 days. But the second portion after ovulation, where you have the corpus luteum, the degenerated corpus luteum, that can differ from woman to woman. And this is the reason why different women will have different lengths to their menstrual cycle. But on average, it's about a 28-day cycle. So again, rising FSH early in the cycle causes follicles to develop, and it's that LH surge that actually triggers ovulation. So in the middle of the cycle, as I pointed out before, a spike in estrogen triggers a spike in LH, and this again is what causes ovulation. So under the influence of LH, this is called luteinizing hormone, it transforms the follicle into corpus luteum. So that's what luteinizing actually means. It turns a follicle into the corpus luteum. So the corpus luteum will produce a lot of progesterone initially, and what this does is you'll see the progesterone levels in the bottom rising after the formation of the corpus luteum, and so this thickens the uterus and prepares the uterus for possible pregnancy. If no pregnancy occurs, then the corpus luteum will degenerate after about 14 days. At that point, the progesterone levels really fall off, and then menstruation will occur as a result of this. Now, birth control pills contain synthetic forms of estrogen and progesterone. So this says they disrupt normal hormonal changes that trigger ovulation. What they basically do is they mimic a state of pregnancy. Um, they mimic a state of pregnancy hormonally, and because it's being mimicked, there's not a second ovulation event. So if there's no ovulation, there's no egg release, and fertilization can't occur. And this is the reason why hormonal birth control tends to be extremely effective.